"Mom, did you ever use the trust fund I set up for you?" Ryan asked, his voice casual, almost distracted, as if he were asking whether I'd watered the plants or paid the electric bill. And I remember standing there in my small kitchen, the hum of my old refrigerator filling the silence between us, my hand still wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, thinking I must have misheard him, because there was no trust fund. There had never been any trust fund. Not in the 2 years since my husband passed. Not in the months I spent choosing between my prescription refills and groceries. Not in the winter when I kept the thermostat at 62 degrees to save on heating. So I looked at my son, really looked at him, at the expensive watch on his wrist, the tailored coat he hadn't taken off yet, and I said, as calmly as I could, "What fund, Ryan?" And just like that, something shifted in the room, subtle but undeniable, like a hairline crack running through glass. Because his smile faltered, just for a second, and his eyes flicked toward Chloe, who was standing near the doorway, perfectly still, her hand resting lightly on the strap of her designer bag, her expression composed in that careful way I had come to recognize over the years, polite but distant, warm enough on the surface, never quite reaching her eyes. And in that brief moment of silence, I felt it. Not anger, not yet, but confusion, deep and unsettling. The kind that settles into your chest and refuses to leave, because nothing about what he had just said matched the reality I had been living. The overdue bills stacked neatly on the corner of my counter, the worn coat hanging by the door, the quiet, careful life I had been managing $1 at a time. And Ryan laughed then, a short, uncertain sound, like he was trying to smooth something over that hadn't fully surfaced yet. "The monthly transfers, Mom. The account I set up after Dad passed, remember? I've been sending you $1,500 a month." And I felt the room tilt slightly, not enough to lose my balance, but enough to make me grip the edge of the counter just a little tighter. $1,500 a month. For 2 years, I did the math without thinking, the numbers lining up in my mind with a clarity that made my stomach tighten. $36,000. Enough to change everything. Enough to make those winters warmer, those choices easier. Enough to mean I had not been struggling alone all this time. Except I had been. I knew I had been. I had lived every single one of those days. And I shook my head slowly, my voice steady despite the noise building quietly inside me. "Ryan, I haven't received anything." And this time, the silence that followed wasn't subtle. It was heavy, pressing in from all sides. And I saw it then, not just confusion on his face, but something sharper, something calculating. The way his mind began to move through possibilities, checking facts, lining up details, while Chloe shifted her weight slightly, just enough to draw my attention, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag before she let go, smoothing her expression into something softer, something practiced. "Maybe there was a mix-up with the bank," she said lightly, stepping forward, her tone gentle, reassuring, as if she were offering a simple explanation for something that didn't feel simple at all. And I nodded, because that's what I had always done. I kept the peace. I accepted the reasonable explanation. I trusted the people I loved. But something inside me had already begun to resist, a quiet voice asking questions I hadn't asked before. Because if there had been a mistake, it wasn't a small one. It wasn't a delayed payment or a missing statement. It was 2 years of something disappearing without a trace. And I set my mug down carefully, noticing the way my hand didn't shake, how calm I appeared from the outside, even as everything inside me began to rearrange itself. "Maybe," I said, meeting Chloe's eyes for just a moment longer than usual, long enough to see the flicker there, quick but real, before she looked away. And in that instant, I understood something I couldn't yet prove, something I couldn't yet name, but it settled into place with a quiet certainty that surprised even me. This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes don't last 2 years. Mistakes don't leave a person counting pennies while money is being sent somewhere else. And as Ryan pulled out his phone, already scrolling, already searching for confirmation, I realized that whatever this was, whatever had been happening without my knowledge, it had just begun to unravel, and I was standing at the very edge of it, not as the confused, struggling mother they thought they knew, but as someone who had just noticed the first crack in a story that no longer made sense. Ryan kept scrolling through his phone, his brow tightening with each swipe, the easy confidence he carried into my kitchen slowly giving way to something more rigid, more controlled. as if he were trying to hold on to a version of reality that no longer aligned with what was happening in front of him. And I watched him carefully, not interrupting, not rushing to fill the silence, because for the first time in a long while, I realized that silence was not my enemy. It was where the truth tended to reveal itself, piece by piece, without needing to be forced. "Here," he said finally, turning the screen toward me, his voice steadier than his expression. "I have the transfers, every month, same date, same amount." And I leaned in slightly, just enough to see the neat rows of numbers, the confirmation emails, the consistent pattern that should have meant stability, support, care, but instead felt like a record of something I had never received, something that had existed somewhere just beyond my reach. And I nodded slowly, taking in the details without reacting the way he expected, because reacting would have meant giving away what I was starting to understand, and I was not ready to do that yet. "Do you recognize the account?" he asked, his tone sharper now, more direct, and I shook my head again. "No, Ryan, I do not." And this time, there was no hesitation in my answer, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that settled deeper with every passing second. And beside him, Chloe let out a soft breath, almost a sigh, as if the situation were becoming inconvenient rather than concerning. "There must be some administrative error," she said, stepping closer, her voice smooth, practiced. "Sometimes these things happen, especially if the account was set up through a third party." And I turned my head slightly to look at her, really look at her, noticing the way her posture remained perfectly composed, the way her expression stayed within that narrow range of polite concern, never quite slipping into genuine worry. And it struck me then how consistent she had always been, not just today, but over the past few years, in the way she managed conversations, redirected questions, offered explanations that sounded reasonable enough to accept, but never quite detailed enough to examine. And I thought about the small things I had overlooked, the times my mail seemed lighter than expected, the occasional comment Ryan made about making sure I was comfortable, the way Chloe would answer questions that were not directed at her, gently, seamlessly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And I felt that quiet voice inside me grow stronger, clearer, no longer just asking questions but beginning to form answers. And Ryan straightened, his frustration now visible. "I will call the bank," he said, already dialing, already shifting into the version of himself that solved problems quickly and efficiently, the businessman who did not tolerate loose ends. And I stepped back slightly, giving him space, because I did not want to interrupt what was about to unfold. I wanted to see it, to hear it, to understand exactly how deep this went. And as he spoke into the phone, explaining the situation, requesting verification, I moved toward the sink, rinsing my mug slowly, methodically, focusing on the simple motion of water against porcelain, because it allowed me to remain calm, to think clearly, to keep my voice steady when I needed it. And after a few minutes, Ryan's tone changed, just slightly, enough for me to notice the edge, softening into something more uncertain, more controlled. "Yes, I understand," he said, glancing briefly in Chloe's direction before turning away, lowering his voice. And when he ended the call, he did not speak right away. He just stood there, phone still in his hand, as if he were deciding which version of the truth to say out loud. And I dried my hands on a towel, turning back toward him, waiting, because patience had served me well for a long time, and it was serving me now. "The account is active," he said finally, his words measured. "The transfers have been received." And there it was, simple, direct, undeniable. The confirmation that what I already knew was true, that the money had gone somewhere, just not to me. And I tilted my head slightly, my voice calm, almost gentle. "Then someone else has been receiving it." And for a moment, no one spoke, not Ryan, not Chloe, not even me, because the implication hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. And Chloe shifted again, just enough to draw attention, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing. And in that hesitation, that brief pause where the explanation should have come easily, but did not, I saw it more clearly than ever before, not just the possibility of deception, but the shape of it, the outline of something carefully constructed over time, something that relied on my silence, my trust, my willingness to accept what I was told without looking too closely. And I realized, standing there in my quiet kitchen, that I had been looking at my life from the wrong angle, that the struggle I thought I was enduring alone might never have been meant to exist at all, and that whatever had been hidden from me was no longer hidden, not completely, not anymore, because the first piece had already fallen into place, and I had no intention of ignoring what came next. Ryan did not look at Chloe immediately after I said it, which told me more than if he had, because silence, I had learned, often revealed the truth faster than any words could, and instead he stared down at his phone again as if the screen might offer a different answer the second time, as if numbers could rearrange themselves into something easier to accept. But they did not. They remained exactly what they were, consistent, precise, undeniable, and I watched the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders squared just slightly, the way a man begins to realize that the situation he thought he controlled has already moved beyond him. "We need to figure out where the money went," he said finally, his tone controlled but firmer now, and Chloe responded before I could, her voice soft, almost soothing. "Ryan, it could still be a clerical issue. These things take time to trace." And there it was again, that gentle redirection. Not a denial, not a confession, just enough to slow things down, to introduce doubt where clarity was beginning to form, and I felt something settle inside me, something colder, more focused, because I had heard that tone before, in different forms, over different years, each time smoothing over something that did not quite add up, each time encouraging patience where perhaps I should have been asking questions, and I realized that what I had once interpreted as grace or diplomacy might have been something else entirely, something far more deliberate, and I stepped away from the counter, moving toward the small table by the window where the morning light always fell just right, because I needed that space, that distance, not from them, but from the version of myself that would have accepted this moment without looking deeper. "How was the account set up?" I asked, keeping my voice even, neutral, the way I used to speak when Ryan was younger and needed guidance without feeling corrected, and he glanced at Chloe again before answering. A small, almost unconscious movement that did not go unnoticed. My assistant handled the paperwork, but Chloe helped coordinate some of the details at the time, and I nodded slowly, letting that information settle into place alongside everything else, because it fit too neatly, not as proof, not yet, but as part of a pattern that was becoming harder to ignore. And Chloe smiled then, a calm, reassuring expression that might have comforted me once. "It was a busy period for all of us, Evelyn. There were a lot of moving parts," she said, her tone light, almost conversational. But there was a precision to her words that I could not unhear, the way she acknowledged involvement without specifying it, the way she framed the situation as complex rather than questionable, and I found myself wondering, not for the first time, how many conversations like this had passed me by without notice, how many details had been presented in just the right way to keep me from looking too closely. And Ryan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "I will get full statements from the bank, everything, transfers, account numbers, recipients," he said, more to himself than to us, and I could see the shift happening in him now, the transition from confusion to investigation, from assumption to verification. And I recognized that same shift within myself, quieter perhaps, less visible, but just as real, because something fundamental had changed in the last few minutes, something that could not be undone, the understanding that the life I had been living, the limitations I had accepted, might not have been the result of circumstance at all. And as Ryan began listing the steps he would take, making calls, requesting documents, moving forward in the way he always did, I remained still, listening, observing, because I had no intention of interrupting what he was about to uncover, but I also had no intention of relying on it alone, because if there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that truth does not always reveal itself fully when someone else is looking for it. Sometimes you have to find it yourself, quietly, without announcing your intentions, without alerting the very people who might try to reshape it. And I turned back toward the sink, rinsing the same cup again even though it was already clean, just to give my hands something to do while my mind worked through what I needed to do next, because waiting was no longer enough, and trusting blindly was no longer an option. And as Chloe stepped closer to Ryan, placing a light hand on his arm, offering quiet reassurance, I saw it clearly now, not just her composure, but the role she had been playing all along. the one I had mistaken for support, for harmony, for balance within the family. And I felt no urge to confront her, no need to challenge her in that moment, because confrontation would have given her something to respond to, something to manage, and I was no longer interested in being managed. I was interested in understanding, in seeing the full picture without interference. And so I said nothing more. I simply watched, listened, and let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable, because in that discomfort, people reveal more than they intend, and I had already begun to notice things I would never overlook again. That night, after they left, the house felt different in a way I could not ignore, not emptier, not quieter, but clearer, as if something that had been sitting just out of focus for years had finally sharpened into view, and I moved through my usual routine with a kind of careful awareness, turning off the lights, checking the locks, rinsing the dishes, each small action grounding me while my mind continued to work through what had happened, replaying every word, every glance, every hesitation. Because there had been too many of them to dismiss, too many small inconsistencies that, when placed together, no longer felt small at all, and I sat down at the kitchen table with a notepad I had not used in months, the paper still crisp, the pen moving slowly at first as I wrote down the details I could remember, dates, amounts, phrases, the timeline Ryan had described, the 2 years of transfers, the consistent monthly pattern, and then I added my own reality beside it. The overdue notices, the times I had stretched a single grocery trip across 2 weeks, the winter mornings when I wore 2 sweaters instead of turning up the heat, and seeing it there, side by side, made something inside me settle into certainty, because this was no longer a feeling, it was a contradiction that could not exist without explanation, and I leaned back in my chair, looking at the list, allowing myself to think beyond the immediate shock, beyond the surface level of what had been said, because if the money had been sent, and if I had not received it, then the path it had taken mattered more than the intention behind it, and I thought about the way Chloe had spoken, not defensive, not surprised, but measured, controlled, as if she had already considered this possibility long before it was ever voiced aloud. And I realized that whatever had happened here had not been sudden, it had been maintained, carefully, consistently, over time, and that kind of consistency required more than a mistake. It required attention, awareness, and a willingness to let something continue unchecked. And I closed my eyes for a moment, not out of exhaustion, but to gather my thoughts, to step away from the emotional weight of it and focus on what needed to be done, because reacting now, confronting them directly, would only disrupt whatever process had already begun, and I needed that process to continue. I needed them to believe that nothing had changed in me, that I was still the same person who would accept explanations without question, who would trust without verifying, because that belief would give me the time and space I needed to understand the full picture. And I opened my eyes again, looking around my kitchen at the familiar objects that had witnessed years of quiet routines, and I felt something shift within me, not anger, not even betrayal in the way people often describe it, but clarity, a calm, deliberate clarity that replaced uncertainty with purpose. And I picked up my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in some time. Arthur Whitmore, the attorney who had handled my husband's estate, a man who had always spoken carefully, precisely, never offering more than necessary, but never withholding what mattered. And I hesitated for just a second before dialing, not because I doubted the call, but because I understood what it represented. A step away from assumption and into verification, a step toward information that could not be softened or explained away. And when his office voicemail answered, I left a message, my voice steady, composed, requesting a meeting, nothing urgent in my tone, nothing that would suggest the weight behind the request, because even now, I was learning to control not just what I knew, but how I revealed that I knew it. And after I ended the call, I set the phone down and returned to my list, adding one more line at the bottom, a simple note to myself, follow the account. Because that was where the truth would be, not in conversations, not in reassurances, but in the path the money had taken, the record that existed somewhere beyond memory or explanation. And I sat there for a long time, not moving, not rushing, just allowing the pieces to settle into place. Because for the first time since Ryan had asked his question, I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I was beginning to understand how to find out. And that, I realized, was far more powerful than any answer they could have given me. Arthur Whitmore called me back the next morning at exactly 9:15, his timing as precise as I remembered, and I was already seated at the kitchen table with my notes in front of me, a fresh cup of coffee untouched at my side, because I had learned long ago that clarity came easier when I was fully present, fully focused, and when I answered the phone, I kept my voice calm, measured, giving nothing away beyond what was necessary. "Evelyn, it has been a while," he said, his tone polite but attentive, the kind of voice that noticed details even when they were not spoken, and I allowed a small pause before responding, just enough to set the pace of the conversation. "Yes, it has. Arthur, I was hoping you might have some time to review a few details from my husband's estate." And there was a brief silence on his end, not hesitation, but consideration, as if he were already shifting through the files in his mind, aligning my request with what he remembered. "Of course," he said finally. "There were several provisions put in place, some of them quite specific. I can have everything ready if you would like to come in." And I nodded to myself, even though he could not see it. "I would appreciate that," I replied, keeping my tone steady. "Nothing urgent. I just want to make sure I understand everything correctly." And that was not entirely untrue, because understanding was exactly what I intended to do, just not in the way he might have expected. And after we ended the call, I sat there for a moment longer, letting the conversation settle, because even in his brief response, there had been something, a subtle emphasis on the word specific, a reminder that what had been arranged years ago might not have been as simple as I had assumed. And I finished my coffee then, taking slow, deliberate sips, allowing the quiet of the morning to steady my thoughts, because what I was about to do required more than curiosity. It required patience, attention, and a willingness to see things exactly as they were, not as I had believed them to be. And later that afternoon, I drove to the bank, not the branch I usually used, but the one Ryan had mentioned during his call, the one connected to the account he had referenced. Because if the money had been transferred consistently, there would be a record, and records, unlike people, did not adjust themselves to fit a narrative. And I walked in without hesitation, my posture straight, my expression neutral, because I had learned that confidence often opened doors that questions alone could not. And when I spoke to the teller, I kept my request simple, direct, providing my identification, explaining that I needed to verify whether any accounts existed under my name that I might not have accessed recently. And she nodded, typing carefully, her eyes scanning the screen with a practiced efficiency. And after a moment, she looked up, her expression polite but slightly puzzled. "I do not see any active accounts under your name other than the one you already use," she said, and I nodded, as if that were expected, as if it confirmed nothing more than a minor oversight. "And are there any accounts linked to my social security number in a custodial or managed capacity?" I asked, keeping my tone even, because the wording mattered, and she paused again, typing a different set of queries, her fingers moving more slowly this time. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a hint of uncertainty. "There is a managed account listed as a trust distribution channel, but it is not directly accessible from here," she said, and I felt that quiet certainty inside me sharpen, not into alarm, but into focus, because this was the first tangible confirmation that something existed beyond what I had been told, something structured, intentional, and I inclined my head slightly, as if considering routine information. "Can you tell me who manages it?" I asked, and she hesitated just long enough to confirm that the answer was not entirely straightforward. "It appears to be handled through a private administrative entity," she said carefully. "You would need authorization to access further details." And I thanked her, genuinely, because she had given me exactly what I needed, not answers, but direction. And as I walked out of the bank, the afternoon sun felt different on my face, not warmer, not brighter, but clearer, because the path I needed to follow was no longer theoretical. It had structure now, it had shape, and it led somewhere specific, somewhere that had been intentionally placed between me and what was meant for me. And I got into my car, sitting there for a moment before starting the engine, not rushing, not reacting, just allowing the realization to settle fully into place, because this was no longer about whether something had gone wrong. It was about understanding how it had been allowed to continue for so long, and, more importantly, who had been making sure that it did. Arthur's office had not changed in the years since I last visited. The same polished wood desk, the same neatly arranged folders, the same quiet order that suggested nothing in that room was ever misplaced or overlooked. And as I sat across from him, I placed my hands calmly in my lap, resisting the urge to open my notebook right away, because I wanted to hear what he would say without prompting, without guiding the conversation too directly. "You mentioned wanting to review the estate provisions," he said, adjusting his glasses slightly as he pulled a file from a drawer, his movements precise, practiced, and I nodded, offering a small, measured smile. Yes, I realized there are details I may not have fully understood at the time. And that was true, though not in the way it might have sounded. And he opened the file, scanning a few pages before continuing. "Your husband was very thorough, Evelyn. He wanted to ensure long-term stability, particularly for you." And something in the way he said that, the slight emphasis on stability, caught my attention, not as a warning, but as a reminder that what had been planned was not accidental or vague. It had been intentional, structured, and I leaned forward just slightly, enough to signal engagement without urgency. "Can you walk me through how the distributions were supposed to work?" I asked, and he nodded, turning the file so that it faced him directly, his finger tracing a line as he explained. "There was a trust established, with monthly distributions allocated for your living expenses. Those were to be managed through an administrative channel to ensure consistency." And I listened carefully, each word aligning with what Ryan had described, each detail confirming that the system itself had been functioning exactly as intended, at least on paper. "And who oversees that administrative channel?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, because this was the question that mattered, and Arthur paused briefly, just long enough to locate the exact page, before answering. "It was assigned to a private management entity, but the primary authorized liaison was listed as your son, with secondary administrative coordination noted under his spouse." And there it was, not surprising, not shocking, but definitive. The structure clearly outlined, the roles clearly assigned, and I felt that quiet clarity settle deeper within me, because this was no longer about assumptions or impressions. It was documented, recorded, formalized, and I nodded slowly, as if processing routine information. So any redirection or adjustment to those funds would require authorization through that liaison? I asked, and Arthur looked up at me then, his expression sharpening slightly, not with suspicion, but with attention. "Yes, any changes would need to be authorized within that structure," he said, and there was a subtle shift in the room, not tension exactly, but awareness, as if he had begun to understand that my questions were not abstract, that they were connected to something specific, something real, and I let a brief silence follow before speaking again, choosing my words carefully. "And if those funds were not reaching their intended recipient?" I asked, and this time his response was slower, more deliberate. "Then that would raise significant concerns," he said, closing the file halfway, his gaze steady now, "because the trust includes protective provisions to prevent misuse." And I felt my breath remain steady, my posture unchanged, even as the weight of his words settled into place. Protective provisions, not just structure, not just process, but safeguards, mechanisms designed to respond if something had gone wrong. And I met his gaze calmly. "What kind of provisions?" I asked, and he hesitated, not out of reluctance, but out of consideration, as if deciding how much to explain without context. "There is a clause," he said finally, his tone measured. "A contingency that activates if there is evidence of intentional misdirection or misuse of the funds by any authorized party." And I held his gaze for a moment longer, allowing the significance of that statement to settle fully, because this was it, not the full answer, but the key to it, the detail that connected everything else, the element that transformed a troubling situation into something with consequences. And I nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging something expected rather than something extraordinary. "I see," I said quietly, and I did not ask for further clarification, not yet, because I did not need more in that moment. I needed to understand what this meant in practice, how it would unfold, how it could be proven, and more importantly, how it could be revealed at the right time. And as Arthur closed the file completely, his attention still focused on me, I realized that the path ahead had just become clearer than ever, not because I had all the answers, but because I finally understood the structure behind them. the system that had been quietly waiting for someone to notice what had been ignored, and I rose from my seat with the same calm composure I had carried in, thanking him for his time. Because what I needed now was not more information, it was the right moment to use it. When I stepped out of Arthur Whitmore's office, the late afternoon light stretched across the sidewalk in long, quiet lines, and I paused there for just a moment before walking to my car, not because I was unsure of what to do next, but because I wanted to feel the weight of what I had just learned settle completely into place, because there was a difference between knowing something and understanding what it meant, and what I understood now was simple, clear, and impossible to ignore. The system had not failed. The money had not disappeared. It had been redirected. And more importantly, there was a clause, a specific provision designed for exactly this situation, something my husband had put in place not out of suspicion, but out of foresight. And as I sat behind the wheel, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, I allowed myself a single, quiet breath, not of relief, not of anger, but of clarity, because everything that had once felt uncertain now had structure. And structure could be followed, could be proven, could be used, and I started the engine, driving home the same way I always did, passing the same streets, the same small shops, the same ordinary details that had not changed, even though everything else had. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already made my decision, not about what had happened, but about how I would respond to it, because reaction, I realized, was not what this situation required. It required timing, precision, and patience. And when I walked into my house, the quiet felt different again, not empty, not heavy, but steady, as if the space itself had aligned with the calm I was now holding inside me. And I placed my keys on the counter, set my bag down, and moved through the kitchen with the same deliberate rhythm I had always had, because nothing about my outward routine needed to change, not yet. And that was the point. Because the more consistent I remained, the less likely anyone would notice the shift that had already taken place. And later that evening, Ryan called, his voice carrying a controlled urgency that confirmed he had not let the matter rest. "Mom, I have requested full documentation from the bank. I should have everything within a couple of days," he said, and I listened carefully, noting the way he chose his words, precise, efficient, focused, and I responded with the same calm tone I had used all day. "That sounds like a good step, Ryan," I said, allowing just enough reassurance to keep the conversation steady. And there was a brief pause before he continued. "Chloe thinks it might still be a processing issue, something with the administrative side." And I almost smiled, not because it was amusing, but because it was expected, the same pattern, the same careful redirection. And I let a small silence follow before answering. "Perhaps," I said simply, because agreement, even partial, was often the easiest way to avoid unnecessary resistance. And after we ended the call, I set my phone down and stood there for a moment, looking at the reflection in the darkened window above the sink, and I saw something in my own expression that had not been there before. Not weakness, not confusion, but a quiet certainty, a calm that did not come from ignorance, but from understanding. And I turned away, reaching for my notebook, opening it to the page where I had written everything down the night before, and I added a new line, "Clause exists," because that was the difference now, the turning point, the detail that transformed everything from a question into a process, and I began outlining what I knew, what I needed, and what I would allow to happen next, because the clause, as Arthur had described it, was not something that activated on suspicion alone. It required evidence, clear, undeniable evidence of intentional misuse. And that meant I needed to let the situation continue just long enough for that evidence to surface fully, for the pattern to become complete, for there to be no room for explanation or denial. And I understood then why my husband had designed it this way, not to trap anyone unfairly, but to ensure that if someone chose to cross that line, they would do so completely, without ambiguity, without escape. And I closed the notebook slowly, placing it back on the table, because the plan did not need to be complicated. It needed to be precise, and precision required patience. And as I turned off the lights and prepared for the evening, I felt no urgency to confront, no desire to accuse, because I already knew something they did not, something they had overlooked. And as I stood there in the quiet of my home, I realized that for the first time since this had begun, I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was waiting for the moment when what they had done would matter. The next 2 days passed with a quiet rhythm that felt almost unchanged on the surface, and that was exactly how I wanted it, because routine, I realized, was the easiest disguise. It allowed everything important to happen underneath without drawing attention, and I kept to my usual schedule, my usual calls, my usual small errands, never once mentioning the meeting with Arthur, never once suggesting that anything had shifted in my understanding, because the less I said, the more space there was for them to continue as they had been. And that was what I needed, not confrontation, not disruption, but continuation, because continuation would complete the pattern, and completion would leave no room for interpretation. And on the third day, Ryan called again, earlier this time, his voice tighter, more controlled. "Mom, I received the statements," he said, and I could hear the difference immediately, not just urgency, but something else, something heavier, the kind of realization that comes when information stops aligning with expectation. And I leaned against the counter, keeping my tone steady, and I asked, simple, neutral, giving him room to speak, and there was a brief pause before he answered. "The transfers were redirected," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Not canceled, not delayed, redirected through a secondary authorization." And I let the silence stretch just a moment longer, not because I needed time to understand, but because I wanted him to hear the weight of what he had just said, to fully process it without interruption. "Do you know who authorized it?" I asked finally, and this time, the pause was longer, heavier, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a restraint that had not been there before. "The authorization traces back to the administrative liaison," he said, and I did not need him to say more, because we both knew what that meant, and yet, neither of us said it out loud. Not yet, because saying it would change the dynamic, it would force a reaction, and reaction was exactly what I was avoiding, and I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost gentle, because calm, I had learned, often unsettled people more than anger ever could. And after we ended the call, I set my phone down and stood there for a moment, feeling that quiet certainty deepen into something more defined, because this was the evidence Arthur had mentioned, not complete yet, but forming, taking shape, and I moved to the table, opening my notebook again, adding another line beneath the last, "Redirection confirmed." And I traced the words lightly with my pen, not out of hesitation, but to fix them in place, because each piece mattered, each detail built towards something larger, something that would not rely on interpretation or persuasion, but on fact. And later that afternoon, Chloe stopped by unannounced, something she rarely did, and I noticed it immediately, the slight shift in pattern, the way she entered with the same composed smile, the same careful warmth, but with an undercurrent that was just barely visible if you knew where to look. "I thought I would check in on you," she said, her voice smooth, effortless, and I welcomed her in without hesitation, because this, too, was part of the process. And as we sat at the table, she spoke lightly about small things, daily routines, trivial updates, never once mentioning the account, never once acknowledging the conversation that had clearly unsettled Ryan, and I listened, nodding when appropriate, responding just enough to maintain the flow. Because I was no longer listening for what she said, I was listening for what she avoided, for the spaces between her words, for the careful omissions that revealed more than any explanation could. And after a few minutes, she leaned forward slightly, her tone softening just a fraction. "Ryan can be a little intense when something does not make sense right away," she said, as if offering reassurance, as if framing his concern as something temporary, manageable, and I met her gaze calmly, holding it just long enough to register the shift. "He cares about details," I replied, my voice even, because I wanted her to understand that I did not dismiss his concern, that I did not see it as something to smooth over. And for the briefest moment, something flickered in her expression, not fear, not quite, but awareness, the recognition that the situation was no longer as easily controlled as it had been before, and she smiled again, recovering quickly, but the moment had already passed, the detail already noted, and when she left, I did not follow her to the door. I simply remained at the table, my hands resting lightly on the surface, because everything was unfolding exactly as it needed to, not quickly, not dramatically, but precisely, and I closed my notebook once more. Because the pattern was nearly complete now, the evidence no longer scattered, but aligned, and I understood with absolute clarity that they still believed they were managing the situation, still believed that with enough explanation, enough time, things would settle back into place, and that belief, I realized, was the final piece I needed, because it would carry them forward just a little further, just enough to ensure that when the clause was finally invoked, there would be nothing left for them to adjust, nothing left for them to explain, only the outcome they had never seen coming. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning, not at my house, not at Ryan's office, but at Arthur Whitmore's firm, where everything would be documented, where nothing could be softened or redirected, and I arrived 10 minutes early, as I always did, sitting in the quiet waiting area with my hands folded neatly in my lap, my posture relaxed, my expression calm, because this was not a confrontation, not in the way people usually imagine those moments. There would be no raised voices, no accusations, only clarity. And when Ryan and Chloe walked in together, I noticed immediately how closely they moved, how aligned they appeared, as if whatever had been said between them before arriving had already been carefully agreed upon. And Ryan gave me a brief nod, his expression controlled, while Chloe offered a polite smile, composed as ever, and we were led into the conference room where Arthur was already seated, a folder placed precisely in front of him, and as we took our seats, I did not speak. I simply waited, because this moment did not belong to me. It belonged to the structure that had been set in place long before any of us had realized we would need it, and Arthur began without hesitation, his voice steady, measured. "Thank you for coming. There are some matters regarding the trust distribution that require clarification," and Ryan leaned forward, slightly, ready to respond, to explain, to manage the situation as he always had. "I have already reviewed the statements," he said, his tone controlled. "There appears to have been a redirection through the administrative channel," and Arthur nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it. "Yes," he said, opening the folder, "and that redirection has now been verified as intentional, authorized under the liaison structure assigned at the time of the trust creation." And there was a brief pause, not silence exactly, but a shift, the moment where explanation would normally follow, where someone would step in to clarify, to justify, but no one did, and Arthur continued, his voice unchanged. "Under the terms of the trust, there is a clause, a contingency designed to address situations where allocated funds are intentionally diverted from their intended recipient." And I saw it then, not in Ryan, who remained focused, trying to process the legal language, but in Chloe, just for a fraction of a second, the smallest tightening around her eyes, the briefest stillness in her posture, as if she recognized something before it was fully spoken, and Arthur turned a page, his finger resting lightly on a paragraph as he read. "If any authorized party is found to have knowingly redirected or withheld designated distributions for personal or unauthorized use, that party forfeits all rights to any current or future assets associated with the trust." And the words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, and Ryan straightened slightly, his attention sharpening. "What does that mean in this case?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge that had not been there before, and Arthur looked directly at him, his expression neutral. "It means that the trust has been restructured effective immediately," he said. "All administrative authority has been revoked, and all associated assets have been reassigned in accordance with the original contingency provision." And there was another pause, longer this time, heavier, because now there was nothing left to interpret, nothing left to manage, only the outcome itself, and Ryan's gaze shifted, not to me, but to Chloe, searching, questioning, while she remained still, her composure intact but thinner now, more deliberate, and I sat there quietly, my hands still folded, my expression unchanged, because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required presence, and Arthur closed the folder, placing it neatly on the table. "You will receive formal documentation outlining the updated structure," he said, his tone final, and Ryan exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation settling into place, while Chloe said nothing at all, and I rose from my seat then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just as I always did when a meeting had concluded, and as I turned toward the door, I paused for just a moment, Not to confront, not to accuse, but simply to acknowledge what had already been decided. And I looked at them both, my voice calm, steady, carrying no anger, no accusation, only clarity. You should have read the clause, I said, and then I walked out, leaving the rest of it exactly where it belonged.